October 24th, 1942. As the guns of El Alamein thundered across the Egyptian desert, Italian General Ettore Baldassare stood beneath a cloudless sky, watching his armored divisions fall silent one by one. The horizon shimmered with heat, and the great desert that once promised glory now offered only humiliation. The engines of the Ariete and Littorio divisions had gone still. Not from British shellfire, but because there was no fuel left to burn. The mighty tanks that had carried Italy's flag into Africa, M13s, Semoventes, and L6, sat motionless, their crews staring helplessly at empty jerry cans. Mechanics pried open fuel lines, drained every drop from trucks, staff cars, and even motorcycles to keep a handful of vehicles moving. But the arithmetic of war was merciless. There was simply not enough fuel to fight. For the Axis armies in North Africa, logistics were a slow death sentence. Every drop of fuel had to cross 1,000 miles of sea, infested with Allied submarines and prowling aircraft. Italy's merchant fleet, already devastated by years of losses, was a shadow of its former self. Convoy after convoy was annihilated in the narrow lanes between Sicily and Tripoli. By the time any fuel reached Rommel's forces, half of it had already been consumed just delivering it. In the early hours of that October morning, Rommel's staff received the final logistical reports. The Axis front line had less than 1 day's worth of fuel. Most tanks couldn't even reposition. Trucks ran dry halfway to their supply dumps. Ammunition convoys stalled in the sand, their drivers desperate and exhausted. And still, the British artillery kept firing. Thousands of shells every minute, supplied by an empire that could ship oil from across the Atlantic faster than Italy could move it across the Mediterranean. General Baldassare understood what the silence meant. The Italian army, for all its courage, was fighting an industrial war with the tools of a pre-industrial nation. Mussolini's dream of empire had been built on borrowed fuel, borrowed steel, and borrowed confidence. The grand speeches in Rome spoke of destiny and Roman revival, but here in the Egyptian desert, reality spoke louder, and it spoke in silence. Later that day, Italian reconnaissance units stumbled upon a wrecked British supply column. Scattered across the dunes were dozens of metal drums marked aviation fuel. They burned furiously, ignited by tracer fire. Italian soldiers rushed forward, desperate to salvage what they could. Some tried to plug bullet holes with sand, others filled canteens with leaking gasoline, hoping to pour it back into their tanks. It was madness. Witnesses remembered officers kneeling beside pools of burning fuel, weeping as they watched salvation go up in flames. For the men of the Ariete division, this was the breaking point. They had fought bravely at Tobruk, at Gazala, and along the endless Libyan coast. But now their fate was sealed not by courage or strategy, but by a simple shortage of oil. The German panzers received what little fuel remained, while Italian units were ordered to hold their positions, immobile, waiting for an enemy that could move at will. When the British offensive began in full, wave after wave of tanks rolled forward under the cover of night and smoke. The Italians returned fire where they could, but without mobility, the desert, once their ally, became their grave. By dawn, the battlefield was a charred wasteland of abandoned vehicles. Captured Italian officers later told Allied interrogators the same haunting truth. We realized then that Italy could build tanks, but not the fuel to move them. El Alamein was more than a defeat. It was a revelation. It exposed the fatal illusion at the heart of Mussolini's empire, that industrial weakness could be masked by rhetoric and pageantry. The truth was brutal. Italy's annual oil consumption during the war barely matched what the United States produced in a single week. The Italian Navy, once proud and powerful, had resorted to draining aviation reserves just to keep its destroyers operational. Every strategic decision, every offensive, was dictated by fuel, or rather, by its absence. By late October, Axis command knew the front was doomed. Rommel's message to Berlin was stark. We are fighting without fuel. But in Rome, Mussolini continued to promise victory. Propaganda films showed columns of tanks advancing through the desert, but those same tanks now sat rusting under the Egyptian sun. The myth of fascist modernity had collided with the arithmetic of logistics, and the result was disaster. When the British launched their full-scale counterattack, supported by massive air power and unlimited fuel, the Axis line shattered. The once proud Ariete Division was encircled and destroyed. Many of its survivors, facing the inevitability of capture, chose to burn their vehicles rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Others simply surrendered, too weak to continue the fight. As the smoke rose over El Alamein, General Baldassarre's words to his staff summed up the moment. "The engines of Italy have stopped. The empire is over." But the story of Italy's fuel collapse didn't end in the desert. It reached into every corner of the Axis alliance, a reminder that wars are not won by courage alone, but by the invisible machinery of oil, industry, and supply. When Rommel finally ordered the retreat, it was not a strategic withdrawal. It was an evacuation. Hundreds of tanks, artillery pieces, and trucks were left behind, perfectly intact but utterly useless. They had no fuel, no future, and no meaning. In a war measured by tons of steel and barrels of oil, Italy's dream had run dry. As Rommel's Africa Corps began its retreat westward, the Italian divisions followed, or rather, tried to. Many never moved at all. In the night, British tanks advanced through the dark, their engines roaring, their headlights flashing across immobilized Italian positions. Soldiers of the Ariete and Littorio divisions watched helplessly as enemy columns passed them by. Some fired until their ammunition ran out. Others waited for capture, knowing that to flee was impossible without fuel. The irony was cruel. The Axis armies in North Africa had never lacked bravery. Italian tank crews had fought with distinction at Bir Hakeim and Gazala. The Ariete division, in particular, was respected by friend and foe alike. Even British reports admitted that their resistance was fierce and disciplined. Yet courage could not refill a fuel tank. The logistical backbone of the Axis had been shattered months before the battle even began. By the summer of 1942, the Mediterranean had become an Allied lake. Ultra-intercepts and aerial reconnaissance allowed British forces to anticipate every Axis convoy. Between January and October of that year, over 60% of Italian merchant shipping destined for North Africa was destroyed. Each sunken tanker meant fewer trucks, fewer aircraft sorties, fewer tanks capable of fighting. A single German panzer division required over 300 tons of fuel per day in active combat. The Italian armored divisions required slightly less, but still more than the entire Axis supply system could deliver. The calculations were hopeless. To move a ton of fuel from Italy to Tobruk cost another ton of fuel to deliver it. The system consumed itself. And so, when the British offensive opened on October 23rd, Rommel's army faced not just an enemy, but the consequences of its own illusions. The British Eighth Army had over 200,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and virtually limitless supplies. Behind them stood a global empire, fueled by oil fields from Iran to Texas. Against this, Rommel could muster barely 50,000 German troops and around 30,000 Italians, supported by tanks that could barely move. Italian officers wrote in their diaries that week of the quiet despair that hung over their camps. One commander noted, "We count our fuel in hours, not days." Another described how he ordered his men to push their vehicles by hand into new positions at night, so British aircraft wouldn't notice that they could not drive. Even Rommel himself was absent at the start of the battle, recovering from illness in Germany, and his replacement, General Stumer, died of a heart attack under the pressure of command. The Axis army was leaderless, starving for fuel and facing annihilation. When Rommel returned to the front days later, he found his forces collapsing. He tried to reorganize the retreat, prioritizing the panzers and critical equipment, but the Italians could not follow. Many of their tanks had to be abandoned. In some cases, crews removed the bolts from their cannons and buried them in the sand to prevent capture. Soldiers walked hundreds of kilometers under the desert sun, dragging whatever supplies they could carry. British units advancing through the battlefield found a strange sight. Hundreds of intact Italian tanks and trucks lined up neatly, their crews gone, their engines dry. One British officer wrote home, "It was as if the desert had swallowed an entire army, not by battle, but by thirst." To the men who survived, El Alamein became a symbol not of defeat in combat, but of betrayal by logistics. They felt abandoned by their homeland, sacrificed for propaganda victories that no longer mattered. Many Italian soldiers still believed in honor and duty, but few still believed in victory. Behind the lines, the fuel situation in Italy itself was desperate. The country had no significant oil reserves and relied heavily on imports from Romania's Ploiești oil fields, controlled by Germany, and from synthetic fuel produced in small quantities by the Germans themselves. But by 1942, German needs far outweighed what could be spared for Italy. Berlin viewed the Italian front as secondary and their ally as unreliable. Italian industry could build aircraft, tanks and trucks, but without petroleum, they were little more than metal carcasses. The fascist regime tried to mask the shortages through grand speeches and patriotic exhibitions, showing model tanks and aircraft to cheering crowds in Rome. But in the factories, workers knew the truth. There was no fuel to test the machines they built. The crisis extended to the Navy as well. The Regia Marina, once one of the most modern fleets in Europe, could barely leave port. Battleships were often kept docked to conserve oil. Destroyers and submarines were sent on limited missions, forced to turn back early for lack of fuel. Some Italian naval commanders even resorted to burning low-quality synthetic fuel that damaged their engines. By the time the British broke through at El Alamein, Italy's war economy was already collapsing from within. The home front suffered constant blackouts and rationing. Civilians queued for hours for a few liters of kerosene. Farmers could no longer operate tractors or transport crops, while the Air Force struggled to keep its aircraft airborne. It was a nation fighting without energy, a war machine running on fumes. And yet, Mussolini refused to acknowledge the truth. His speeches in late 1942 remained filled with bombast, promising that Italian valor would overcome material disadvantage. "The British have fuel," he declared, "but we have faith." To his audience, weary from years of war and hunger, it sounded hollow. Faith could not move tanks. Rommel's retreat through Libya became one of the most harrowing journeys of the war. The Italian divisions, lacking transport, marched on foot or clung to German trucks. Thousands were left behind. The desert was littered with their abandoned equipment, a graveyard of ambition. When Allied troops reached those positions days later, they discovered not an army defeated in battle, but one starved to death by its own logistics. It was the material proof that Italy's industrial base could never sustain a modern war. The retreat from El Alamein became a nightmare, written in oil stains and exhaustion. What little fuel remained was hoarded for the German panzers and staff cars. Italian officers begged for allocations, but the reply was always the same: none available. Trucks were abandoned in the sand, their drivers ordered to destroy the engines. Some soldiers wept as they smashed the machines they had once believed would carry them to victory. By early November, Rommel's columns stretched across hundreds of kilometers, a broken procession of steel and dust. The desert, once a symbol of Axis boldness, now became an open tomb. Mechanics tried to rig makeshift fuel systems, siphoning the last drops from wrecks and aircraft fuel tanks. But the laws of physics and arithmetic could not be cheated. Without a steady supply, every kilometer of retreat was a battle against immobility. Those who survived the desert crossing told stories of desperation that bordered on madness. Men drained water from radiators to drink. They dismantled weapons to barter spare parts for food, or a ride in a passing truck. The dream of empire that Mussolini had promised, of Italian soldiers marching like Romans through Africa, ended in a column of men walking silently through the sand, their shadows long and thin in the dying sun. British and Commonwealth forces, fueled and supplied from Alexandria and the Suez Canal, pressed relentlessly westward. Their vehicles rolled without pause, consuming an ocean of fuel that seemed infinite to the Axis soldiers watching them. The difference was not just tactical, it was civilizational. The Allies drew upon global logistics, on refineries in the Middle East, convoys from America, and fleets that moved millions of tons of fuel with mathematical precision. The Axis, by contrast, had gambled everything on a fragile maritime route and an illusion of self-sufficiency. Historians would later call El Alamein the turning point of the North African campaign. But for Italy, it was more than that. It was the day the mask fell. The Italian High Command had built its strategies on borrowed promises from Berlin, believing that German technology and planning would compensate for Italian industrial weakness. Yet, when the oil ran out, it was clear that Italy was not an equal partner in the Axis alliance. It was a dependent state, living on whatever scraps Germany could spare. The oil crisis that doomed Italy at El Alamein had begun years earlier. Mussolini's government had pursued self-sufficiency through a propaganda campaign called autarkia, economic independence. The regime promised to make Italy immune to foreign dependence, developing synthetic fuels, domestic production, and colonial oil sources. But the numbers told another story. Italy had no significant petroleum fields. Its colonial possessions in Libya offered minor reserves that were barely exploitable, and the synthetic fuel projects in northern Italy were too small to matter. By 1940, when Italy entered the war, it imported over 90% of its oil from abroad, mostly from the United States, Romania, and the Dutch East Indies. Within months, all three sources were cut off. American exports ceased after Italy invaded France and declared war on Britain. The Dutch East Indies fell under Japanese control, and the remaining Romanian oil was already committed to Germany. What followed was a slow suffocation. Factories in Turin and Milan continued to produce tanks and trucks, but most never reached the front. Trains were immobilized by shortages. Pilots trained in gliders because aviation fuel was too precious to waste. Even the police and postal services in Rome were ordered to reduce vehicle use by half. By 1942, the fascist dream of an industrial empire had shrunk into a grim economy of rationing and improvisation. At El Alamein, the consequences of this systemic failure were displayed in their purest form. The Ariete Division's tanks, already underpowered compared to British Shermans and Grants, could not maneuver. Without fuel, even their short-range radio systems failed, leaving units blind and deaf on the battlefield. The Littorio Division, freshly arrived from Italy, barely participated in the fighting before it was annihilated. The British artillery and air power struck at will, unopposed by Italian aircraft, grounded for lack of aviation fuel. When the end came, it came suddenly. By November 4th, Rommel reported that his army was in full retreat. That same day, Italian headquarters in Tripoli sent a desperate message to Rome. "We can no longer sustain operations. The fuel crisis is total." But in Mussolini's palace at the Piazza Venezia, the radio broadcast another message, a declaration that Italian valor will yet prevail. The contradiction was grotesque. In North Africa, Italian soldiers burned their own vehicles to prevent capture. In Rome, crowds were told of victories that no longer existed. Captured Italian prisoners were astonished by what they saw in British camps. Rows of supply trucks, vast fuel depots, and field kitchens operating with efficiency and abundance. One officer later said, "It was not the tanks that defeated us. It was the gasoline." He was right. The war in North Africa had always been, at its core, a war of logistics. Geography was destiny. Every mile of desert required enormous consumption of water, fuel, and spare parts. For every tank that reached the front, 10 tons of supplies had to follow. Germany could not provide it, and Italy could not produce it. Even after El Alamein, Mussolini refused to acknowledge the depth of the disaster. He continued to send divisions to Libya, hoping to re-establish a line in Tunisia. But by then, the Americans had landed in Algeria and Morocco. The Mediterranean was fully under Allied control. The few remaining Italian convoys were massacred at sea. Tankers sank in flames, staining the water with the last oil Italy could afford to lose. The Italian High Command's reports became a grim litany of shortages. No aviation fuel, no motor oil, no lubricants, even the most basic supplies. Spark plugs, filters, hoses had to be cannibalized from destroyed vehicles. The once mechanized divisions became infantry again, trudging through the desert as their enemies roared past in convoys stretching for miles. Rommel himself understood the truth long before his political masters did. In his final report on the North African campaign, he wrote, "The bravest men are helpless without fuel." He had commanded some of the most brilliant tactical victories in military history, but even his genius could not change the fact that engines run only as long as oil flows. To the Italian officers who survived, El Alamein was not just a lost battle. It was an awakening. They had believed in the promise of fascism, that Italy would stand shoulder to shoulder with the great powers. But now they saw that their nation had entered a modern war with a medieval economy. For them, the silence of stalled engines in the desert was the sound of defeat. By the winter of 1942, the Axis retreat had turned into a rout. The once proud armies that had marched into Egypt with banners flying now stumbled westward toward Libya, pursued by relentless British armor. For the Italians, the retreat was not just physical, it was psychological. Every step back across the desert was a step deeper into the realization that the dream of empire had been an illusion from the start. In villages along the Libyan coast, Italian rear echelon units tried to prepare defensive positions, but without fuel, even their construction vehicles and generators could not function. Engineers dug trenches by hand. Soldiers used donkeys to pull artillery. The very sight of it, men and beasts replacing machines, symbolized the regression of Italy's war effort from modern mechanization to primitive survival. Meanwhile, British and American forces were moving faster than ever before. Their convoys seemed endless, supported by a logistics network that reached from Cairo to Cape Town and beyond. Allied supply ships brought oil in such quantities that it became almost invisible, an assumed constant of war. For the Axis, every drop of gasoline was a crisis. For the Allies, it was a number on a ledger, replenished as quickly as it was consumed. Rommel's reports to Berlin grew increasingly bitter. He complained that German headquarters treated the North African front as a secondary theater, refusing to prioritize shipments of fuel. In one message he wrote, "We can win no battles without petrol. Every tank that stops becomes a tomb." Berlin's response was bureaucratic and indifferent. Germany's own oil situation was worsening, and what little remained was earmarked for the Eastern Front. Italy's pleas for more shipments were met with silence or vague promises. Back in Italy, the population was beginning to feel the same shortages that had crippled the army. Public transport nearly collapsed. Civilian car use was banned entirely in many regions. Farmers plowed fields with oxen again, and the once celebrated modern highways, the pride of Mussolini's propaganda, became empty stretches of asphalt. The regime called it sacrificing for victory, but few believed it anymore. The press was censored, yet even fascist newspapers could not hide the bad news from North Africa. Articles praised the heroic resistance of the Ariete division, but admitted that the division had ceased to exist. Radio broadcasts glorified the tactical withdrawal to stronger positions, but everyone understood that it meant retreat. The Italian people, who had once cheered Mussolini's promises of a modern empire, were now whispering the same phrase that soldiers in the desert had muttered weeks earlier. La guerra è perduta. The war is lost. In December 1942, British troops reached El Alamein, deep in Libya. Italian forces tried to establish a new line, but the same pattern repeated. Lack of fuel, lack of mobility, lack of hope. The Germans prioritized their own escape, often commandeering Italian trucks and supplies. This created deep resentment. Italian officers accused their German allies of arrogance and betrayal. German officers, in turn, mocked the Italians as unreliable. What united them was hunger, exhaustion, and the knowledge that the desert would soon claim them all. The psychological collapse within the Italian army was profound. Soldiers began to doubt the purpose of their sacrifice. They no longer fought for Mussolini, or even for victory, but simply for survival. Letters intercepted by Allied intelligence revealed a tone of despair. "We have no fuel, no food, and no reason left. We fight only because there is nowhere to go." In Rome, Mussolini's circle clung to fantasy. Propaganda films still showed footage of armored columns rolling through the sand, old clips reused from earlier victories. Mussolini himself ordered the production of new miracle fuels from synthetic sources. Factories experimented with alcohol mixtures and coal-based substitutes, but the results were catastrophic. Engines seized, tanks caught fire, and aircraft engines failed mid-flight. The effort consumed precious resources and time that Italy could not afford. Even as the regime pretended that victory was still possible, Allied bombers were proving otherwise. By early 1943, they began targeting Italy's remaining oil depots, refineries, and rail junctions. Each air raid tightened the noose. The last surviving fuel convoys from Italy to North Africa were obliterated by Allied aircraft operating from Malta. The sea that had once been the lifeline of Mussolini's empire became its graveyard. On January 23, 1943, British forces entered Tripoli. For the Italians, this was the final humiliation. The city that Mussolini had once called the fourth shore of Italy, a jewel of fascist colonialism, fell without a fight. Italian soldiers watched their flags being torn down by civilians before the British even arrived. In a single day, 2 decades of propaganda about the rebirth of the Roman Empire turned to dust. What remained of the Italian army fled to Tunisia, where Rommel tried to regroup for one last stand. But even there, the fuel crisis continued. Allied air superiority made every shipment from Sicily a death sentence. Italian and German ships burned on the sea before they could reach port. Rommel's tank divisions had to ration their fuel to the point that some units were limited to 30 minutes of movement per day. By March 1943, the end was near. The Axis front in Tunisia was surrounded on 3 sides, starved of fuel and ammunition. Yet Mussolini, isolated and delusional, ordered total resistance. He still believed that Hitler would send reinforcements, that the tide would turn, but Hitler was already planning for Sicily and southern Italy, abandoning North Africa as a lost cause. On May 13, 1943, the remnants of Axis forces in Africa surrendered, over 230,000 men, including 100,000 Italians. It was the largest capitulation in Italian history. Most of them had not been defeated in open battle, but immobilized by empty fuel tanks. The British noted that many captured vehicles were still intact, their engines pristine, their fuel gauges on 0. One Italian general summed it up with brutal honesty during his interrogation. "We did not lose the war in Africa. We ran out of gasoline." The fuel collapse at El Alamein had become the blueprint for Italy's total defeat. Without energy, its army, navy, and air force were nothing but shells. Impressive in parades, powerless in war. The industrial illusion that Mussolini had built for 2 decades had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow empire sustained only by propaganda. But even after losing Africa, Italy's ordeal was far from over. The same shortages that had strangled the army abroad would soon suffocate the country at home. The collapse of the North African front sent shockwaves through Italy. By the summer of 1943, the entire nation had begun to feel what the soldiers at El Alamein had experienced months earlier. Paralysis. Fuel shortages crippled every aspect of daily life. The trains that once carried coal and supplies across the peninsula now stood motionless at the stations. Even the trucks that distributed food to cities could not move. Rome, once illuminated in fascist grandeur, now lived in darkness. Streetlights were extinguished to conserve electricity. Civilians pushed bicycles or carts because there was no gasoline. The black market flourished, selling a few liters of stolen fuel at prices most could not afford. Those who had once cheered Mussolini's promises of industrial greatness now stood in breadlines, watching Allied bombers overhead. Factories that had been repurposed for war production began shutting down. Without fuel and raw materials, assembly lines halted. In Turin, workers of the Fiat plants, the same company that had produced the tanks for North Africa, now stood idle, listening to distant sirens as Allied air raids targeted the industrial heart of Italy. Every explosion reminded them that the same machines they once built for glory now lay rusting in the desert, abandoned for lack of fuel. The propaganda machine tried to hide the truth. Mussolini's radio broadcasts spoke of temporary reverses and strategic regroupings. Posters still depicted Italian tanks advancing triumphantly through the sands, even as everyone knew those tanks had been captured intact by the British. In reality, the war economy was collapsing. The Regia Aeronautica, Italy's air force, was virtually grounded. Pilots trained on simulators made of wood, painted to resemble cockpits. Actual flight training became rare, as aviation fuel was rationed for only the most critical missions. Squadrons were ordered to limit operations to defensive patrols, and even then, aircraft often failed to take off due to empty tanks. The pride of Fascist Italy, its modern air fleet, had been reduced to impotence. Even the Regia Marina, once one of Europe's most advanced navies, faced the same fate. The great battleships Vittorio Veneto and Littorio rarely left port. Their enormous fuel requirements made every voyage a political decision. Destroyers and submarines sat docked for months at a time, used more as floating batteries than ships. When convoys to North Africa were needed most, there was simply no fuel to protect them. The irony was that Mussolini had built his regime on symbols of speed and modernity: cars, aircraft, tanks, and trains. Fascism celebrated motion, power, and mechanical strength. But by 1943, Italy had become a nation of stillness. The engines that once symbolized the future were silent. The roads were empty. The empire that had promised dynamism had frozen in place. When the Allies invaded Sicily in July 1943, the same story repeated. Italian defenders fought bravely but without mobility. Many coastal batteries could not rotate their guns because the generators were out of fuel. Trucks carrying reinforcements broke down halfway to their destinations. Aircraft were unable to intercept Allied bombers because there was not enough aviation gasoline to scramble more than a handful. Within weeks, Sicily fell. For the Italian soldiers who had survived North Africa and returned home, the invasion confirmed what they already knew. The war was unwinnable. They had seen the truth in the desert. Courage could not overcome arithmetic. The Allies' logistical superiority was absolute. For every barrel of oil Italy consumed, the Allies produced 1,000. In July, as the bombs fell on Rome, the Fascist Grand Council turned against its own leader. Marshal Pietro Badoglio and other generals confronted Mussolini with the military reports he had ignored for months. The numbers were devastating. Italy's total fuel reserves had fallen below 100,000 tons, barely enough to sustain military operations for 2 weeks. The Air Force had reserves for less than 10 days of combat. The Navy could not even attempt a sortie without risking permanent immobilization. The Council voted to remove Mussolini. When King Victor Emmanuel III met him on July 25th, the Duchy still clung to delusion, claiming that a miracle offensive was being prepared. The king simply replied, "No one can fight without fuel." Hours later, Mussolini was arrested. In the weeks that followed, Italy disintegrated. The new government secretly negotiated with the Allies, desperate to end the war. But before an armistice could take effect, Germany moved to occupy its former ally. Hitler's forces flooded into the Italian peninsula, seizing what little fuel and resources remained. The Germans stripped depots, confiscated trains, and took control of refineries. The Italian army, already demoralized, split apart, some joining the Allies, others forced into German service. For ordinary Italians, the occupation brought even greater suffering. The few remaining drops of gasoline were reserved for German military vehicles. Civilians resorted to bicycles, horse-drawn carts, and even walking long distances between towns. In rural areas, farmers began distilling crude alcohol fuels from potatoes and grapes to power generators, but it was dangerous and inefficient. Fires were common. The legacy of El Alamein haunted every corner of Italy. It was no longer just a distant defeat in the desert. It was a symbol of the nation's systemic failure. The silence of engines that had echoed across Egypt now filled the streets of Rome, Naples, and Florence. The mechanical heart of fascism had stopped beating. Allied intelligence officers later analyzed the Italian economy and concluded that it had been structurally incapable of sustaining modern warfare. The numbers were irrefutable. During the entire war, Italy had produced less than 3 million barrels of oil. By contrast, the United States produced that amount every 8 hours. Mussolini's empire had been doomed not by strategy, but by physics, the simple fact that an army cannot move without fuel. Every tank, every aircraft, every ship was a slave to that invisible master. When the oil stopped flowing, the empire stopped breathing. The men who had once fought in North Africa returned to their homeland to find it in ruins. They carried with them the bitter wisdom of El Alamein. That modern war was not won by courage, but by combustion. And in that silence, Italy finally understood that it had never truly been a modern power. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the shadow of El Alamein stretched across the entire Italian peninsula. The country had become a battlefield, divided between the Allies advancing from the south and the Germans retreating toward the north, dragging Italy's resources with them. But even in this new phase of the war, the same old problem dictated everything: fuel. German commanders occupying Italy quickly realized that they could not rely on local production. Refineries at Livorno, Trieste, and Genoa had been bombed into ruin. Oil depots were empty. Supply trains from Germany were constantly ambushed or destroyed by Allied air raids. The Wehrmacht resorted to stealing fuel from Italian civilians, hospitals, and even fire departments to keep its trucks and tanks running. Entire villages were left in darkness as generators were dismantled for parts. Meanwhile, the Italian co-belligerent army, fighting alongside the Allies after the armistice, faced its own logistical nightmare. The soldiers who once served under the fascist flag now wore new uniforms but marched on foot. Their vehicles were worn-out relics scavenged from battlefields. Even when the Allies tried to supply them, much of the fuel went to higher-priority American and British units. For Italian soldiers, it was a bitter irony to fight for liberation in the same conditions that had caused their defeat. In the cities, the collapse of fuel supply marked the collapse of everyday life. Electricity was rationed to a few hours per day. Public transport disappeared. The once busy train stations of Milan and Naples became silent cathedrals of abandonment, filled with wrecked locomotives and stranded freight cars. People moved by bicycle, by cart, or on foot, often through streets still littered with rubble from air raids. And yet, beneath the ruins, the memory of El Alamein still lingered, not as a distant military failure, but as a moral reckoning. Soldiers who had fought there spoke quietly of that night in the desert when their tanks had gone silent, and their officers had realized that Italy's destiny was sealed. They had seen the truth long before their leaders had admitted it. A modern army without fuel is not an army at all. By 1944, Italy had become an occupied laboratory of energy desperation. German engineers tried to produce fuel from coal gasification plants in the north, while partisans sabotaged pipelines and depots to hinder the enemy. In some areas, civilians used olive oil or lamp oil to power makeshift engines. It was improvisation born of starvation, proof that even the most inventive people could not overcome the basic arithmetic of war. As Allied forces advanced through the peninsula, they brought with them a torrent of fuel, drums of gasoline, columns of tanker trucks, and vast storage depots. To the Italian civilians who saw them, it was a revelation. The sound of American engines, endless and powerful, became the sound of liberation. They had so much fuel, one Italian recalled, that they used it to wash their hands. It was an exaggeration, but it captured the awe and humiliation of a people who had been starved of energy for years. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Where the Allies moved effortlessly, the Germans retreated painfully. Their vehicles sputtered and burned out. Tanks were abandoned in ditches, cannons left behind for lack of towing power. The story of El Alamein was repeating itself, not in the sands of Egypt, but in the mountains of Italy. fuel, once again, was deciding the fate of nations. In April 1945, as the Axis front finally crumbled, Mussolini tried to flee north. His convoy was small, just a few trucks and cars, most running on diluted or stolen fuel. Eyewitnesses remembered them sputtering to a halt repeatedly as they climbed toward Lake Como. Even in his final days, the dictator who had once promised endless speed and conquest was trapped by the same shortage that had destroyed his armies. He was captured and executed before he could cross the border. His empire gone, his ideology reduced to dust and rusted engines. When the war ended, the ruins of Italy's war machine told a story more powerful than any speech or monument. Along highways and rail lines lay thousands of wrecked vehicles. Some German, some Italian. All symbols of a nation that had tried to wage a modern war without the means to sustain it. Abandoned tanks still sat where they had stopped years earlier, their fuel gauges frozen on empty. In the years that followed, historians, engineers, and economists would study the Italian collapse to understand what had gone wrong. Their conclusions were unanimous. Italy had entered the Second World War with the will to fight, but without the material foundation to win. Its total annual energy production had been less than 2% of that of the United States. Even if no battle had been fought, even if every Italian soldier had been a hero, the outcome could not have changed. Industrial warfare is powered not by passion, but by petroleum. And yet, amid the tragedy, there was a strange dignity in how many Italian soldiers faced the inevitable. They fought on long after the fuel had run out, using captured British trucks, scavenging gasoline from wrecks, and even converting engines to run on alcohol. They refused to surrender easily, not out of belief in fascism, but out of duty to each other. In their endurance, there was a quiet heroism, one born not of victory, but of endurance against futility. The Battle of El Alamein is often remembered as the turning point of the Desert War, the moment when Rommel's invincibility was broken and the Allies began their advance into Europe. But for Italy, it was something deeper. It was the moment when a nation's illusion of strength evaporated under the merciless sun. The battlefield that day was not just fought with shells and bullets, but with the invisible measure of barrels and gallons. When the last engines of the Ariete and Littorio divisions fell silent, so too did the dream of fascist modernity. The empire Mussolini had promised, fast, mechanized, unstoppable, died in the sand because it ran out of the very thing that defined modernity itself: fuel. Years later, an Italian veteran of El Alamein was asked what he remembered most about the battle. He didn't speak of gunfire, or of British tanks, or of the desert heat. He simply said, "The silence. The engine stopped, and we knew it was over." That silence still echoes across history. The sound of a nation realizing that it had already lost the war long before the guns went quiet. The sound of engines dying in the desert. The sound of Italy's empire burning, not in fire, but in absence. The day the fuel ran out was the day the fascist dream ended. And from that moment onward, every battle, every speech, every symbol of power was only an echo, the fading noise of a machine that had already stopped.